Hi everybody, and welcome back to part 6 of the Tamiya 132 scale Mosquito build. Last time in part 5 you'll remember, if you've seen that I managed to build the Tamiya port engine. It's not completely fixed into the nacelle at the moment. There's some work to do on the nacelle before it can be completely fitted into place. But the engine's done as a first step. This time though, I'm going to be building one of the Brassin engines from the Eduard Brassin set. This actually is the set which has both the port and starboard engines in it, but I'm just going to be doing the starboard. As you've seen, I've already built the port one from the Tamiya set. And because of the time I've got, the limited time I've got in the shed this week, I'm just going to concentrate on getting the engine built on its own. I'm not going to have time to get it into its mountings or the nacelle as I've done with the Tamiya engine. And that's because really the detail in the Brassin sets is quite a bit more, and sometimes working with resin is a little bit harder and a bit more time consuming to clean up than plastic parts. So I'm going to focus on getting the engine built up with the supercharger, get the detailing around the engine block done using the Brassin set, and then next time I'll go on and bring it to the same stage as this Tamiya port engine. And at that point I'll maybe be able to go back and detail and maybe even use one or two of the Brassin parts to further add detail to this Tamiya engine as well. So we'll see how we go with that, and we'll just get straight over, get the box opened up and see what's in this Brassin set. Okay, so let's take a look at these Brassin engines. This particular set that I'm working with here is 090, which is obviously for the pair of engines, but I believe that Eduard also provide a single engine option as well, which is maybe the one that I should have gone for. But at the time that I bought this, I was intending to build both Brassin engines. So we'll just take a look. The instructions are very extensive, and I think I've mentioned before that because of the difference between the port and starboard engine mounting arrangement, the instructions actually build two engines separately, more or less. So they tend to look quite complicated, and I've still not really got the hang of Eduard's way of presenting the instructions. They have all these different number codes and letter codes, which I think can be a bit confusing, but maybe that's just me. The letters here in red are basically sub-assemblies. So in this particular case we're building the cylinder banks for one of the engines, and in this subsection we're building some additional details onto it, the spark plugs and so on. So we've got these three sub-assemblies, A, B and C, which is a supercharger assembly, and those are what I'm going to be starting with in this video. So I'll just identify the parts that we're going to need, the R54, R77, 63 and so on, and we'll start to do a bit of work on them with some of the wire that we need to be fitting to this particular assembly. So I'll get these parts sorted out first of all, get them trimmed up, and we'll see what we can do with them after that. The part numbers are all identified in the casting block, so R54 is one of the parts that we need. So R54 and R55, those are the parts that we need for this particular first step. These new Brassin sets from Eduard have pretty good connection points. They're not too heavy, but even so we do need to remove some of these casting blocks, particularly the one here on the cylinder. And if you've used resin before, you'll know that you don't want to be breathing resin dust if you're sewing or cutting resin. It is poisonous, it's harmful to your lungs, so you do need to protect yourself from the dust. The way I do that is to cut the parts underwater or in water, so that rather than the dust going into the air, it forms a sludge basically, and you can just wash it away. So that's the way that I'm going to be doing these. So that eventually comes off fairly clean. But what I was doing there was just making a saw cut on both sides of the cut line. And that's because sometimes it's easy when you're going through with a saw to have it at slightly the wrong angle, and what happens then is you come out on the other side having removed too much of the material. Whereas if you make sure that you're cutting to the line that you want on both sides, eventually you'll cut through and it'll just snap off in a nice straight line. And just sand the remnants off that again, nice and wet, so we're not creating any dust at all. You could, if you want to take extra precautions, wear a face mask. I don't when I'm using water to collect all the dust. You can see it all collecting in the water dish here. We'll do the other cylinder. I'm angling slightly away from the cut. Again, that's so that we don't go too high on the other side of the cylinder bank. And then that just snaps off. With some of these parts you do have to be a bit careful to cut off at the right place. Just pay attention to the assembly drawings. Can remove some parts like this with the side cutters as well. Or we can trim it with a knife like that. One thing that I like about working with resin, it's really easy to cement. I always use super glue. This is medium CA. I need to drill out the spark plug holes here in this side of the cylinder. So I'll do that now before I fit any more delicate parts. These parts here, which are 62 and 63, are the spark plug lead conduits, and we just want to remove these carefully because they do have a mounting stub on them, which I don't want to break because otherwise they'll be difficult to fit. You have to be a bit careful with delicate resin parts like this. They easily snap. Just a gentle scrape along the bottom where the resin moulding flash was. There's a slight difficulty with this first part because it doesn't actually fit into the holes provided in the cylinder. The mounting lugs here are too far apart. So I'm going to have to cut off one or other of them, not both. So to solve that problem, I've just cemented the back attachment point as it's meant to go, and I just shortened this front bracket just so that it mounts straight onto the what I think is an oil pipe underneath. So it's in the correct position. It's just that that front bracket's slightly too far forward. It should be tucking in here underneath. These are the spark plugs, so we'll get those in next up. The spark plugs just need to be positioned carefully. The two at the back of the engine here face forwards and the other four face backwards. That's just so that they meet up with the relative holes in the spark plug lead pipe here. So for the spark plug leads, Edward suggests that we use 0.4mm wire. But just looking at that, it looks ever so slightly too thick to me. So I'm just going to go down a gauge and use 0.3. It's just a little bit finer. And I'll use this white so that hopefully you'll be able to see it a little bit better. I think that'll give us a better look. So this is the Brassin supercharger and all the parts that we've got to fit to it now. Quite a big casting block on this one. This part actually was probably 4 or 5, maybe more parts in the Tamiya kit, but it's all one in this. Checking the fit of the supercharger onto the back of the crankcase, just to make sure that I've got the casting block off cleanly, which I have. I'm just drilling this part out because it needs a couple of wires attached to it. That's the first step then of the supercharger assembly. I've got all the cables and pipework on the back. It's much busier than the Tamiya equivalent that is on the port engine, and I'm not sure how much of that can be seen actually, but we'll see when we come to fit it to the bulkhead. Okay, so if I just refer back to this first page of instructions, I've done the cylinders and the first part of the supercharger assembly, all this. So that's the first page done. The next section here goes on to the port engine. We're going to be doing the starboard engine, so I need to just skip ahead a little bit. So here I've skipped ahead to page 12. Gives us the next step of the starboard engine. So we want the main part here, which is the crankcase. So we've got some ancillary parts to fit to the crankcase, and then we can fit the cylinders. I ended up breaking this resin part. I tried to prise it off the casting block before it was ready, and I managed to snap it. But one good thing about resin is that it glues very, very easily with super glue or CA, so we won't have any difficulty repairing that. But before I assemble it, I'm going to drill out the holes that we're going to need for the pipe work. I'm just straightening that piece of copper out. This is 0.8 millimeters, and it's just for the rear of this unit here. I'm going to have to remove these parts because they're not fitting properly into these holes at the back of the engine. The fit of this part here is just interfering with getting these cylinders located properly. So I think I'm just going to have to take a little bit off the bottom. They don't look right to me at all. I'm sure I've got them on the right side, but the fit looks really strange. So I'm going to take them off. I must say these cylinders aren't a brilliant fit. They're very tight into the sockets. So I think I'm going to have to glue the cylinders in place and sort out how I'm going to deal with these pipes at the back. Okay, let's see if we can work out what's going on with these pieces here. So they're possibly best left off until you've got the cylinders into position, because the angle of them is very critical really, to whether or not they'll fit into this back part of the engine. Okay, so with all those trials over with, try and get this supercharger on now. I have to say these resin parts are not the best fit. But that's gone in reasonably okay. So now that I've got it in position, I'll secure that with some extra thin super glue. Just wick that in to the join. That's gone in okay actually. Okay, so with all those parts together, those assemblies, I can now go on to the front of the engine, build the prop shaft crankcase here at the front. Okay, we'll put the induction side together now. This is a unit that goes on the inside of the V. We've got a harness here in etched brass, which we need to fit to the pipe here. If you've seen part 5, you remember that I didn't actually fit the induction before I painted the engine black, and that was just to get the paint down at the bottom of the V here. And I'll do the same here for the Brassin parts. So I'm just going to assemble these parts first off by putting the main unit in the V. Then this piece with the pipe on it, which has to join to the back of the engine here. So doing it like that with the main induction part loose just means that you can line everything up before you commit to any glue. So that's in the correct position now. It joins up here at the back, and we can put the etched brass harness on now. Can remove that. We know that that's all going to fit. I then just have to arrange the harness wires, the individual wires, through these spaces in the induction. We can't see underneath, so it doesn't particularly matter about joining them up on the underside. But you do need to get them through the correct part here. It doesn't matter as well if they're slightly bent and twisted, it just gives the impression of them being cables that are just being pushed through. This assembly would be a useful addition to the Tamiya engine. It doesn't have any of this detail on it. We've got the induction unit in the Tamiya plastic, but we don't have the etched brass or this pipe which connects to the back of the engine. So I might take a look at fitting the second Brassin set of parts to the Tamiya port engine that I did last time. So it's quite busy. So that just drops in once it's all painted up. With a couple of pipes to fit now. I think that's about as far as I can go at the moment before applying any paint. So I'm going to get this over, get a coat of primer on it and make sure it's ready for the overall coat of some semi-gloss black. Just a nice thin coat of Mr. Surfacer 1500, and that's just brought all the detail to life on there. So I'll just give this a coat of semi-gloss black. I love one of the Tamiya lacquer paints, and then maybe do a little bit of detail painting on it. As I did with the Tamiya engine, I'm just going to give this a very light dry brushing with some aluminium just to hit the detail. But I don't want this to look as though it's gunmetal. So very, very gentle with this. Just looking to catch the tops of the bolts. Just the edges of all this detail as well, just to highlight it out a bit really. Anything that's matte black or a semi-gloss black, a big block of it like this, it's difficult to see the detail, so this just helps bring that to relief. There's hardly any paint on this brush at all, and that's how you want it, just to give you the control so that you don't overdo it. There's so much more definition on these resin parts than the Tamiya kit, even though, as I've said before, the Tamiya moulding is really good, but it can't compare to these resin engines. Okay, so that's enough for the dry brushing. I don't want to overdo it. And now I'll do some detail painting just to really pick out one or two of the bolt head detail. And what I'm trying to do here is match the work that I did on the Tamiya engine. I'll just get that one out as a cross-reference really. The induction manifold's fitted here, and as you can see it's gone in just as we intended, with the pipe connecting up at the back here. I've also gone ahead and added a wash to these aluminium parts here, just as I did on the Tamiya engine, and I hadn't actually realised that the pipes here that are fitted from the Brassin set on both sides are the equivalent of these pipes here on the Tamiya engine. And really, I would have been better painting these in the copper colour before I actually fitted them. But I've had to go in and brush paint those pipes to match the Tamiya engine. The Tamiya part, the equivalent part for these pipes, is actually a one-piece unit that goes all the way across the top of the engine and joins onto the other side. But because of the way the Brassin bearers are constructed, which is a one-piece assembly, that's the left-hand side one, it's not possible to have a single run of piping because it snakes in between all the bearers, as you can see here. So the compromise for having a one-piece bearer unit is to have a multi-piece pipe run for this particular assembly. I think on balance I would prefer to have the one-piece bearer unit and put up with having to join multiple pieces of pipework together. So that's looking good. We've just got the ducting for the top of the supercharger to fit, and there's quite a bit more plumbing to go onto the engine once it's installed into the bearers, and we'll be doing that at the beginning of the next episode, preparing these resin parts. As you can see, I've removed this one from the blocks. It just needs a bit of the flashing taken away, and then we'll be able to look to install them. That's the next step in the Brassin instructions. Okay, so there we are. 1 or 2 days work to get the Brassin engine built up and up to that stage, but it's certainly an awful lot more detailed than the Tamiya equivalent, which is this one on the port side. And the detail really comes from the additional plumbing and cables and so on that are virtually all represented in the Brassin set. So it's quite a bit more work to get all that sorted out. So next time I want to get this engine into the same position that we've got the port engine from the Tamiya kit. In other words, in its mountings, on the bulkhead, and ready to go with building both nacelles. And I mentioned at the beginning of the video that I might use some of the Brassin parts to detail the Tamiya engine, and I'm going to be able to do that. There's 1 or 2 parts, particularly on the induction, the harness that I fitted on the Brassin set. I've got another set obviously, and I'll use those parts to add some more detail to the Tamiya kit and get them as far as possible to look identical. So we'll see how that goes in the next episode. So the build of the Tamiya Mosquito is going to occupy the Friday premiere slot for the next 2 to 3 weeks, probably at least, until I've made a final decision on the next naval build. And in that time, I'm hoping to get the engines fully built up into the nacelles and the nacelles on the wings. So ready to get the wings fitted to the airframe over those next 2 to 3 weeks. That's my plan anyway. I am getting close to making a decision about the next naval build, but it's not a decision that I want to rush into really, because I've got a few considerations to make. One of which is time. Obviously, I've got some other builds going on in the shed. And the other one is the amount of space I've got. It looks to be plenty of space here in the shed, but with 132 scale aircraft builds on the bench and a couple of other projects, I've got to think carefully about what naval project to tackle next. But as soon as I've thought through that, I'll let you know, obviously. So I'll crack on with the Mosquito build, and hopefully I'll get a little bit more done on the P51 Mustang, the 148 scale build. So until then, everybody, look after yourselves, stay safe, enjoy your modelling, and I'll see you next Friday. Bye for now.